Now we start off with block 7 with implementing strategy and stakeholder engagement. So management must first formulate a strategy, implement the strategy, and then execute the strategy. In terms of strategy formulation, it means deciding what needs to be done. It involves developing the vision, mission, external threats and opportunities, and internal strengths and weaknesses. And it also involves choosing a strategy based on the SWOT or PESTEL analysis to help decide what to do. And then in terms of strategy implementation, it involves moving an idea from a concept to reality by developing a plan. Implementation becomes the action plans, what you need to do to achieve the strategy formulated. And then you move to strategy execution. This involves carrying out the plan. It involves the act, manner, or style of executing those processes by means of actions, maneuvers, and behaviors. And here we also have IOWs, implementation of work, the activities you undertake to turn your implemented strategy into commercial success. And according to the linear model of strategy, you start with formulation, then implementation, and then execution. So it's linear or happens in a sequence. And you should know that strategy execution is often incorporated into or falls under strategy implementation. But now let's take a look at the challenges in formulation to implementation. So because of the shift in responsibility from strategists to divisional or functional managers, problems in implementation can arise. So divisional or functional managers need to be involved in both formulation and implementation stages so the strategies don't come as a surprise. And another problem is that managers and employees may be driven more by their self-interest than by organizational interests. But now let's take a look at implementation strategies. So implementation varies among different types of organizations. Some examples include changing sales territories, adding new departments, closing facilities, hiring new staff, developing new employee benefits, changing the pricing strategy, and establishing new cost control measures, etc. But let's talk a bit about the interdependence of strategy formulation and implementation. Neither formulation nor implementation can succeed without the other. Successful firms are those that evaluate and adjust their strategies and execution according to the feedback from the implementation process itself. But now let's take a look at why implementation stumbles. Things like employees saying, "I need to get back to my real job," or not being able to translate ideas into actions, or you get no reward for sticking with it, or you lose track and can't easily monitor progress, or everyone's responsible or nobody's responsible, or reality intrudes or the plan loses relevance. But what is the implementation process? Well, first you refine the vision and strategies, you craft the implementation programs, you integrate the programs or roll up, you present to the board or senior management, so ratification, and lastly there's implementation. But now let's take a look at implementation barriers. So in terms of internal barriers, we have resources, so financial or budget. We have human barriers, so inadequate skills, role ambiguity, and organizational culture, so being risk averse. And then in terms of external barriers, we have government overregulation, market dynamics, and conflicting stakeholder interests. But now let's talk a bit about the implementation gap. So this is where there's a disconnect between the strategists and the implementers, so middle managers and line employees. Employees aren't aware or don't understand the strategy, and the strategy is never implemented. So if employees lack knowledge about the strategy, it leads to poor or no implementation, which leads to poor performance. But now let's take a look at the 7 rules for successful strategy implementation. Well, first, keep it simple. Then challenge assumptions. Speak the same language. Discuss resource deployment early. Identify priorities. Continuously monitor performance. And lastly, develop execution ability. And in terms of the implementation framework, we have the corporate strategy, which feeds the business strategy, which feeds the functional planning, which feeds the operational planning. So the basic activities of strategy implementation involve establishment of objectives, formulation of policies for the implementation of strategies, the allocation of resources, actual performance of tasks and activities, and leading and controlling the performance of activities or tactics at various levels of the organization. But what is the purpose of objectives? Well, they serve as guidelines for actions, directing and channeling efforts and activities of organizational members. They're a source of legitimacy in an enterprise by justifying actions to stakeholders. They serve as standards for performance. They provide employee motivation and identification. They give incentives for managers and employees to perform. And they become a basis for organizational design. And objectives are essential for strategy implementation because they guide you on how to allocate resources. They're a mechanism to evaluate managers. They're effective for monitoring progress towards achieving goals. They help to determine organizational, divisional, and departmental priorities, and they keep the strategic plan on track. And you should know that the best objectives are SMART, so specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, timed, and challenging. But now let's take a look at the implementation levers, and these are critical variables of implementation. So the first lever is structure. This is the manner in which responsibilities, people, and tasks are organized. It includes authority, hierarchy, units, divisions, and coordinating mechanisms. So you should know the chain of command, who they're responsible for or accountable to. And then the other lever is people and rewards. So successful implementation depends on having the right people, trained or skilled to support successful implementation. Rewards or incentives can accelerate or undermine strategy implementation. And then the last lever we have is systems. These are the organizational processes and procedures used for daily operations. For example, resource allocation systems, budgeting, distribution, etc. But then what is stakeholder management? Well, this is the ability to form and maintain positive relationships with stakeholders and managing their expectations. So in terms of stakeholder engagement, through communication management, you can uncover unforeseen risks, and creating the right perception enhances success. And you can't meet the goals or needs of all stakeholders. Therefore, companies must identify the most important stakeholder and prioritize strategies to meet their needs. So stakeholder analysis. So in terms of stakeholder analysis, the first step is to identify your stakeholders. The second step is to identify stakeholder interests and concerns. The third step is to identify the claims stakeholders are most likely to make about the organization. The fourth step is to identify the stakeholders who are important from the organization's perspective, so stakeholder mapping. And then the fifth and last step is to identify the resulting strategic challenges. Now in terms of stakeholder groups, we have primary stakeholders and secondary stakeholders. Primary stakeholders have a direct involvement at stake. For example, shareholders, employees, customers, etc. And then secondary stakeholders have a special interest or public stake. For example, the government, community, the media, competitors, etc. And now in terms of stakeholder interests, we have economic interests, government interests, and social interests. Economic interests may be perceived as selfish or greedy, but they're legitimate. Companies need financing to survive. This results in the ability to do good. So hire more people, employee well-being, corporate social responsibility, etc. Government interests are for the good of society, but stringent regulations may hurt profits of small businesses especially. So for legislation or legal concerns, you go to the ombudsman and they investigate the complaint. Now in terms of social interests is where it may do well for both the company and the community. For example, security concerns, environment, etc. But now let's take a look at the common conflicts and stakeholder interests. Well, first we could have the pursuit of short-term profits at the expense of long-term investments, investing in growth strategies that require more funds through share issues or loans, risking financial security and independence. Going public on the securities exchange brings unwelcome openness. Expanding into the mass market may lead to a reduction in quality. And in multinational organizations, conflicts may arise from differences between the host country and the company's head office. So stakeholder mapping involves 4 steps. So the first step is determining influence on strategy formulation. The second step is identifying major stakeholder groups. The third step is determining the effects of strategy decisions on stakeholders. And then the fourth and last step is determining stakeholder power and influence on strategic decisions. So now let's take a look at step 1, determining influence on strategy formulation. So which stakeholders are or should be involved or consulted in strategy formulation? So first we have organizational stakeholders, so top level, middle, or frontline or low level workers. And then we have capital stakeholders. They affect the availability of capital, so shareholders, venture capitalists, banks, etc. And then we have product market stakeholders. So these are those whom the company shares its industry. So this could be suppliers, distributors, or customers. And then we have social stakeholders. These are external groups and organizations that may be affected by or exercise influence over a firm's strategy and performance. For example, unions, government, and activist groups. So in terms of direct stakeholders, these are claims made by those with their own voice. Claims are usually unambiguous and are made directly between the stakeholder and the organization. And then in terms of indirect stakeholders, these stakeholders are unable to make a claim directly because they are inarticulate or voiceless. This doesn't invalidate their claims though. Then we move on to step 2, determining the effects of strategy decision on the identified stakeholder. Here you determine the most important stakeholders based on how the firm's strategy impacts the stakeholders directly or indirectly. Then we move on to step 3, determining stakeholder power and influence on strategic decisions. So first of all, power is the ability of individuals or groups to persuade, induce, or coerce others. It's not just hierarchy, but also a function of the resources controlled by the person, know-how, or networks they're a part of. And in this step, we determine the degree to which a stakeholder group can exercise power and influence over the decisions of the firm. And we ask ourselves, what type of power is it? Is it direct control, veto power, nuisance, indirect influence, or no influence? And although stakeholders affected by the firm's decisions often have power and influence over those decisions, this isn't always the case. For example, employees directly affected by a firm's decisions have no say in those decisions sometimes. But now let's take a look at the sources of power within organizations and for external stakeholders. So within organizations, we have hierarchy. So this is formal power. For example, autocratic decision making. And then we have influence. So this is informal power. For example, charismatic leadership. And then we have the control of strategic resources, for example, strategic products. And then we have the position of knowledge and skills, for example, computer specialists. And then the control of the human environment, for example, negotiating skills. And then the involvement in strategy implementation, for example, by exercising discretion. And then the sources of power for external stakeholders is first the control of strategic resources, for example, materials, labor, money. And then the involvement in strategy implementation, for example, distribution outlets, agents, etc. And then the position of knowledge or skills, for example, subcontractors, partners, etc. And then they also have power through internal links, and this is informal influence. And so stakeholder mapping can help in the 3 aspects of the coalition building process. So the first aspect is analyzing who the key blockers or facilitators of a strategy are and developing an appropriate response. Then the second aspect is repositioning of certain stakeholders. For example, to lessen the influence of a key player or to ensure there are more key players who will champion the strategy. And this is crucial in the public sector context. And then the third and last aspect is maintaining the level of power of some key stakeholders. For example, the endorsement or support by powerful suppliers or customers may be crucial for the success of a strategy. Now we move on to block 8, business ethics, corporate governance, and CSR. So what is ethics? Well, it concerns the principles of right or wrong conduct. And business ethics is the application of general ethical principles to the actions and decisions of businesses and the conduct of their personnel. And this is because business actions have to be judged in the context of society's right and wrong. But now let's take a look at ethical standards or schools of thought. Well, first we have the School of Ethical Universalism. This believes that the fundamental concept of right and wrong are universal and transcend culture, society, and religion. And the collective views puts clear boundaries on what's right or wrong. Then we move on to ethical relativism. Here, different religions, customs, and cultures give rise to multiple beliefs of what's right and wrong. So whether a business-related behavior is right or wrong depends on the prevailing local ethical standards. So the local ethical standards take precedent over ethical standards of the company. The weakness of this is that it gives rise to ethical dilemmas or conflicts. And then lastly, we have the social contracts theory. This ethical principle is based on collective views of multiple societies to form a social contract to be observed by everyone. But now let's take a look at the drivers of unethical strategies and business behavior. So first we have deliberate oversight or self-dealing. For example, insider trading, exchanging information to gain advantage in the stock market or in the mortgage lending practices. So responsible corporate governance and oversight is needed by a company's corporate board to guard against self-dealing. And self-dealing is where managers use their position for self-interest and those of the firm's interests. So you need rules to increase oversight and reform policies. Another driver of unethical strategies is key personnel being pressured to meet sales and profit expectations of shareholders. And this is essentially short-termism. So focusing on short-term performance at the expense of long-term strategic objectives. And cutting ethical corners puts shareholders at risk. You could pay fines and it could be costly. Another driver of unethical strategies is company culture that puts profits and performance ahead of ethics. So overall, the drivers of unethical strategies is faulty oversight and self-dealing, so greed and ambition, pressure for short-term performance, so reputation, and a weak or corrupt ethical environment, so bending the rules. But then why should company strategies be ethical? Well, this is because strategy that's unethical is morally wrong and reflects badly on the strategy of the company and personnel. So that's the moral case. Another reason is that an ethical strategy can be good business and serve the self-interest of shareholders. But now let's take a look at the costs companies incur when ethical wrongdoing is discovered. First, let's take a look at the visible costs. Well, first we have government fines and penalties, civil penalties arising from class action lawsuits and other litigation, and the cost to shareholders in the form of lower stock price and possibly lower dividends. And then we also have internal administrative costs. So the legal and investigative costs incurred by the company, the cost of providing remedial education and ethics training to company personnel, the cost of taking corrective actions, and admin costs associated with ensuring future compliance. Then we have the intangible or less visible costs. So here we have customer defections, loss of reputation, lost employee morale and higher degrees of employee cynicism, higher employee turnover, higher recruiting costs and difficulty in attracting talented employees, adverse effects on employee productivity, and the cost of complying with often harsher government regulations. But again, what are the consequences of unethical business practices? Well, we have sizable civil fines and stockholder lawsuits, having a devastating image and public relations hit, sharp stock price drops as investors lose confidence, and even criminal indictments and convictions. But who are the board of directors? Well, as representatives of the shareholders, directors have both the authority and the responsibility to establish basic corporate policies and to ensure that they're followed. But then what is corporate governance? Well, corporate governance is the system by which businesses are directed and controlled by their owners. So it's the role of how the board of directors approve top management decisions that affect the company's long-term performance and the benefit of the shareholder. But now let's talk about the King 4 Code of Good Corporate Governance. And this exists to achieve governance outcomes. So the King 4 Code is to ensure that the application of the principles achieves specifically identified outcomes, including ethical culture, good performance, effective control, and/or legitimacy. So King 4 clarifies and requires the board to approve the formal strategy made by management and then provide oversight over the policies and plans that are developed from the approved strategy. But then what is the importance of governance in business? Well, it provides guidelines for governance structures, ethical conduct, and performance measurement and reporting. And good corporate governance plays a vital role in underpinning the integrity and efficiency of financial markets. And if companies are well governed, they'll usually outperform other companies and will be able to attract investors. But now let's take a look at the King Code characteristics of good corporate governance. Well, first is discipline, the behavior that is universally recognized and accepted to be correct and proper. For example, ethical conduct. And then we have transparency, independent source of making sense of company performance and actions. For example, an integrated report. And then we have independence, minimizing or avoiding conflict of interest. For example, non-executive directorship and sub-board committees. And then we have accountability, so the management should be accountable for their decisions. For example, investor relations feedback. And then we have responsibility, so corrective action for mismanagement. For example, a disciplinary hearing. And then we have fairness. For example, equal consideration for shareholders. For example, AGM and proxy forms. And lastly, we have social responsibility. So having consideration for environmental and social issues, for example, social investments. But now let's talk a bit about agency theory. So what happens here is that the principal or shareholder appoints an agent or management to perform tasks relating to business performance. And so the essence of corporate governance is controlling the point at which there's a separation between the perspectives of the principal and the agent. There may be a conflict of interest where the agent is seen as self-seeking or self-interested. And this is the agency problem. And the solution to the agency problem is to find ways to benefit shareholders and stakeholders, ensuring shareholders get positive returns on their investment while resources and profits managed by corporate executives protect the interest of shareholders. So, but what is an integrated report? Well, this is communication about how an organization's strategy, governance, performance, and prospects in the context of the external environment lead to the creation of value over the short, medium, and long term. And it's founded on integrated thinking. And you should know that integrated thinking underpins seeing the organization as an integral part of society, so corporate citizen, having a stakeholder inclusive approach, sustainable development, and integrated reporting. And you should know that corporate governance is related to strategy in the following ways. The organizational vision and mission should be reflected in its strategy. And by doing so, it sets the scene for responsible business aims, practices, and general conduct. And then the economic, social, and environmental objectives have to be formulated as part of the organizational strategy. And it ties in with a balanced view of profitability and performance. And we should know the execution of strategy should be monitored and controlled by management and the board of directors. And the board must ensure executives are penalized for failures or rewarded for successes. And these are the ways that corporate governance is related to strategy. But now, what is corporate social responsibility? So corporate social responsibility, or CSR, is a firm's duty to operate in an honorable manner, provide good working conditions for employees, encourage workforce diversity, be a good steward of the environment, and actively work to better the quality of life in the local communities where they operate and society at large. But now let's take a look at the 5 components of a CSR strategy. Well, first we have actions to ensure the company operates honorably and ethically. Then we have actions to support philanthropy, participate in community service, and better the quality of life worldwide. And then we get actions to protect and sustain the environment, actions to enhance employee well-being and make the company a great place to work, and then actions to promote workforce diversity. But then what is a CSR strategy anyway? Well, this is the combination of socially beneficial activities the company opts to support with its contribution of time, money, and resources. We also have the triple bottom line. A company should excel on 3 measures of performance. We've got economic, which deals with profit, we've got social, which deals with people, and environmental, which deals with the planet. But then what are sustainable business practices? Well, these are practices of a firm that meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability to meet the needs of the future. But then what is an environmental sustainability strategy? Well, an environmental sustainability strategy consists of a firm's deliberate actions to protect the environment, provide longevity of natural resources, maintain ecological support systems for future generations, and guard against dangers that could lead to the ultimate destruction of the planet. But now let's take a look at some of the key aspects of sustainable business practices. Well, first is helping to keep the Earth's natural resources within levels that can be replenished via the use of sustainable business practices, containing the adverse effects of greenhouse gases and other forms of air pollution to reduce adverse effects, for example, climate change, having a greater reliance on sustainable energy sources like solar, the use of recyclable materials, using sustainable methods of growing food, and habitat protection and environmentally sound waste management practices, etc. But now let's take a look at the moral case for CSR and environmentally sustainable business practices. Well, the moral case is that the business must not only act in a manner that benefits the owner, but all stakeholders. It's the right thing to do. Another is being civic-minded. Having decency which contributes to society's well-being should be expected of any business. So this involves being a corporate citizen. And another is that the business operates an implied social contract with society. Society grants the business the ability to operate, and in exchange, the business is expected to act as a responsible citizen. So to promote the general well-being of society and do no harm. But now let's take a look at the business case for CSR and environmentally sustainable business practices. Well, in terms of the business case, it can increase buyer patronage. So it gives the business a competitive advantage as consumers prefer businesses that are good corporate citizens. Another is that it reduces the risk of reputation damaging incidents. It can lower costs and enhance employee recruiting and employee retention. Employees want to work for companies with a good reputation, and this results in lower costs for staff recruitment and training. We also have opportunities for revenue enhancement. Companies striving to be innovative leads to new products and opportunities for revenue enhancement, for example, using animal waste to make fuel. And lastly, well-conceived CSR strategies and sustainable business products are best for the long-term interests of shareholders. It contributes to economic value created by the company and improves its profitability, winning contracts, and increases share price and enhances revenue per share. Now we start off with block 9 with strategy execution. So in terms of committing to executing a strategy, it entails figuring out the specific techniques, actions, and behaviors necessary for a smooth strategy supportive operation. It also entails following through to get things done and deliver results, making things happen, leadership, and making them happen right, management. And a good strategy execution requires a team effort. So all managers should have strategy executing responsibility, and all employees are active participants in execution. But now let's take a look at the 10 basic tasks of the strategy execution process. Well, first is developing resources and capabilities required for successful strategy execution, establishing a strategy supportive organizational structure, allocating sufficient resources to the strategy execution effort, instituting policies and procedures that facilitate strategy execution, adopting business management processes that drive continuous improvement, installing information and operating systems that support strategy execution activities, tying rewards directly to the achievement of performance objectives, fostering a corporate culture that promotes good strategy execution, exercising the leadership needed to propel strategy execution forward, and staffing the organization with the right people for executing the strategy. So the two signs of good strategy execution are beating performance targets and performing value chain activities that support operational excellence. Now let's talk about the 3 key actions for building an organization capable of good strategy execution. Well, first is staffing the organization, so putting together a strong management team and recruiting and retaining talented employees. And then the second action is acquiring, developing, and strengthening key resources and capabilities. So both of these actions are strategy supportive resources and capabilities. And then now the third action is structuring the organization and work effort. So this involves instituting organizational arrangements that facilitate good strategy execution. And this is for making a strategy supportive organizational structure. So now let's talk about putting together a strong management team. Well, here you need planners who ask tough questions and figure out what needs to be done, and then implementers who can select, manage, and lead the right people. And then we need executors who turn decisions into actions that drive the changes that produce sustainable competitive advantage. So for the management team is PI. And then in terms of recruiting, training, and retaining capable employees, first you need to intensively screen and evaluate applicants to ensure you're selecting those who are best suited and best fitted. Second, you should provide training programs throughout the employees' careers. Third is to offer challenging, interesting, and skill-stretching assignments. And then fourth is rotating people through jobs that span functional or geographic boundaries. So 1 to 4 is star. And then fifth is making the work environment stimulating and engaging so the firm is considered a great place to work. Sixth is encouraging employees to propose creative ways of operating better and to push ideas for new products or businesses. Seventh is retaining employees using assorted financial incentives and perks. And then eighth is coaching average performers to improve their skills and capabilities while weeding out underperformers. So 5 to 8 is Merc. Now we move on to the second action. But what are capabilities? Well, these are the bundle of skills and know-how that are integrated into organizational routines and are deployed within activity systems through the combined effort of teams. A capability must be continually renewed or refreshed to remain aligned with customer expectations and competitive positions. Now let's take a look at the 3 approaches to building and strengthening capabilities. First is developing organizational capabilities internally. And then second is acquiring capabilities through mergers and acquisitions. Then third is accessing capabilities through collaborative partnerships. Some managerial actions to develop and renew competencies and capabilities internally is by strengthening the firm's base of skills, knowledge, and intellect, and then coordinating and integrating the efforts of work groups and departments. And then in terms of acquiring capabilities through mergers and acquisitions, you have to ask yourself 3 questions. First is the question of market opportunity. When a market opportunity has to be exploited faster than a needed capability can be created internally, then you can go for mergers or acquisitions. Then you ask yourself the question of competitive necessity. You should go for mergers and acquisitions when the industry conditions, technology, or competitors are moving at a rapid pace and time is of the essence. And then you ask yourself the question of successful integration. So the tacit knowledge and complex routines should be readily transferable from one organizational unit to another. So you need to check for internal fit before going with a merger or acquisition. So it's MIT and TIM. And then when acquiring capabilities from an external source, you collaborate with a firm that has complementary resources and capabilities, outsource the function requiring the capabilities to a key supplier or another provider, and then engage in collaborative partnerships for the purpose of learning how the partner does things. Then when is training important? So this is when executing a strategy that requires different skills, competitive capabilities, and operating methods, when there are organizational efforts to build skills-based competencies, and when supplying technical know-how to employees when rapidly changing technology puts a firm in danger of losing its ability to compete. And so superior strategy execution is possible when capabilities maximize organizational resources and the capabilities support the business model, when the capabilities are difficult to imitate and are socially complex processes that take a long time to develop, when they enable a firm to react more quickly to market changes, beat competitors to market with new products and services, and gain uncontested market dominance, and when the capabilities lower costs and permit firms to deliver more value to customers. But now let's talk a bit about structuring work effort to promote successful strategy execution. Well, first you decide which value chain activities to perform internally and which ones to outsource. align the organizational structure with the strategy, decide how much authority to centralize at the top and how much to delegate down the line, and facilitate collaboration with external partners and strategic allies. So in terms of deciding which value chain activities to perform internally and which to outsource, some of the benefits of outsourcing strategy execution is decreasing bureaucracies. So it flattens the structure, speeds up decision making, and shortens response time to changing market conditions. It also adds to a firm's capabilities and contributes to better strategy execution through partnerships with suppliers and channel partners. It also helps in outperforming rivals in strategy critical activities and in turning a competence into a distinctive competence. Now let's talk about aligning the firm's organizational structure with the strategy. So the organizational structure comprises the formal and informal arrangements of tasks, responsibilities, lines of authority, and reporting relationships for the firm. And then structure is aligned with strategy when its design contributes to the creation of value for customers, when its parts are aligned with one another and also match the requirements of its strategy, and when it lowers operating costs through lower bureaucratic costs and operational efficiencies. But now let's take a look at the relationship between strategy and structure. So modifying the current strategy or selecting a new one calls for changes to organizational structure. And the relationship between strategy and structure is a reciprocal relationship. Changes to one causes a change in the other. And we should know no one structure is superior to others. Strategy structure fit can lead to competitive advantage and above average returns, and a structure must match the strategy, and structural choice should be based on control, coordination, and motivation issues, and several structure forms can be used to implement strategies. So the first structure we look at is a simple structure, or the line and staff or flat structure. Here we have the manager at the top and then all the employees in one level at the bottom. So the simple structure consists of a central executive who handles all major decisions and oversees all operations. And then we move on to the functional structure, or the departmental or unit structure. So here we have the CEO at the top and different departments under them. So the functional structure is organized into functional departmental managers who report to the CEO. And this has task specialization or productivity advantages. And then we have the multi-divisional structure, or the divisional or M form. So here, for example, we'd have the board of directors and then the northern, eastern, and southern division. And under that, you'll have the different functions and then the managers and then the employees. So the multi-divisional structure is a decentralized structure consisting of a set of operating divisions organized along products, customers, and geographic lines. And then we move on to the matrix structure, or the composite or combination structure. Here, for example, we have the general manager and then different departments, and then each manager having their own team for each department. So the matrix structure is a combination that overlays one structure onto another with multiple reporting structures. So to pick a basic organizational design that matches strategy, it must supplement design with appropriate coordinating mechanisms, institute collaborative networking and communication arrangements, and consider the environment. But now let's take a look at the organizational approaches to decision making. So first we have centralized decision making, and here authority is retained by top management. Then we have decentralized decision making. Here authority is delegated to lower level managers and employees. So the basic tenets of the centralized organizational structure is that decisions on most matters of importance should be in the hands of top-level managers, and they're the ones who have the experience, expertise, and judgment to decide what is the best course of action. Another tenet is that lower-level personnel have neither the knowledge, time, nor inclination to properly manage the tasks they're performing. And then another tenet is that strong control from the top is a more effective means for coordinating company actions. And then some of the basic tenets for the decentralized organizational structure is that decision-making authority should be put in the hands of the people closest to and most familiar with the situation. Those with decision-making authority should be trained to exercise good judgment. And then the last tenet is that a company that draws on the combined intellectual capital of all its employees can outperform a command and control company. But now let's take a look at the advantages of the centralized and decentralized decision-making. So the advantages of the centralized organizational structure is that it fixes accountability through tight control from the top. It eliminates the potential for conflicting goals and actions on the part of lower-level managers. It facilitates quick decision-making and strong leadership in crisis situations. And lastly, changes in strategic perspective are more easily facilitated. And now let's look at the advantages of the decentralized organizational structure. While this structure encourages company employees to exercise initiative and act responsibly, it promotes greater motivation and involvement in the business on the part of more company personnel. It spurs new ideas and creative thinking. It allows for fast response to market change, and entails fewer layers of management. But now let's take a look at the disadvantages of the centralized and decentralized decision making. While the disadvantages of the centralized organizational structure is that it lengthens response times by those closest to the market conditions because they need to seek approval for their actions. And it doesn't encourage responsibility among lower level managers and rank and file employees. It also discourages lower level managers and employees from exercising any initiative. Now let's take a look at the primary disadvantages of the decentralized organizational structure. While it may result in higher level managers being unaware of actions taken by empowered personnel under their supervision, it can lead to inconsistent or conflicting approaches by different managers and employees, and it can impair cross-unit collaboration. But now let's talk about facilitating collaboration with external partners and strategic allies. While organizational mechanisms, whether formal or informal, are also required to ensure effective working relationships with each major constituency involved in strategy execution. But what is creating a network structure? Well, this is using relationship managers to build and maintain cooperative arrangements of value for both parties. And then what are strategic alliances? Well, these are non-equity collaborative agreements between two organizations towards a common purpose. And then outsourcing arrangements is a contract between the company or any of its subsidiaries and a third party to which the third party provides services or support. And then what is a joint venture? Well, this is a equity mode of entry, establishing a new corporate entity. And then what are cooperative partnerships? Well, these are agreements and actions made by consenting organizations to share resources to accomplish a mutual goal. Now we move on to block 10 with corporate culture and leadership. So when it comes to strategy-driven budgeting, so allocating resources, you should screen resource requests carefully, approve only those that contribute to strategy execution, provide the level of resources necessary for the success of the strategic initiatives, then shift resources to higher priority activities where new execution initiatives are needed. And we should know that policies and operating procedures facilitate strategy execution by providing top-down guidance regarding how things need to be done, so effective and efficient ways of doing things, helping ensure consistency in how execution critical activities are performed, so standardizing activities across geographic units, and promoting the creation of a work climate that facilitates good strategy execution, so policies that help for changing culture and supports new strategic initiatives. But now let's talk about managing continuous improvement. So first you'd benchmark, and then you'd look for best practices to adopt into the organization, and then business process re-engineering, and then total quality management, TQM, and then the Six Sigma quality programs. So let's take a look at the 3 powerful business tools for promoting operating excellence and strategy execution. First, we look at business process re-engineering. So this involves radically redesigning and streamlining work effort, flows and processes to achieve dramatic improvements in performance. And it uses cross-functional teams, cutting-edge technology, and information systems to reset and refocus the organization's strategy. And then the second business tool we look at is total quality management, TQM. So this involves creating a total quality culture involving managers and employees at all levels, bent on continuously improving performance of every task and value chain activity. It's a long-term race without a finish line in which success comes slowly in small steps forward. And then third, we look at the Six Sigma quality programs. So the Six Sigma quality control programs utilize statistical methods to improve quality by reducing defects and variability in business processes. So the Six Sigma principles is that all work is a process, all processes have variability, and all processes create data that can explain the variability. So when using Six Sigma in new projects, you should define, measure, analyze, design, and verify. So in terms of defining, you ask yourself what the project goals and customer requirements are. You ask yourself how you measure and determine both the goals and the needs of the customer. Then you analyze what existing process options you have for meeting customer needs. And for designing, you should ask yourself whether to use an old or new process to meet customer needs and specifications. And in terms of verification, you ask yourself how you'll verify design performance and the ability to meet customer needs. And then in terms of using Six Sigma and existing processes, you have to define, measure, analyze, improve, and control. So in terms of defining, you define what constitutes a defect or variation. In terms of measuring, you collect data to find out why, how, and how often this defect occurs. In terms of analyzing, you determine when, why, and where the defect is occurring. Then in terms of improving, you implement the best practice to eliminate the defect or variation. And then in terms of control, you implement training, monitoring, and controls to sustain the environment. So for Six Sigma and new projects is DMADV, DMADV, And for existing processes is DMAIC, DMAIC. Now let's take a look at the difference between business process reengineering and continuous improvement. So business process reengineering aims at one-time quantum improvement, and then continuous improvement aims at ongoing incremental improvements and includes TQM, Total Quality Management, and Six Sigma. But both of these contribute to top-notch strategy execution and operating excellence. But now let's take a look at the action steps to realize the value of TQM and Six Sigma initiatives. So first, you should demonstrate commitment to total quality and continuous improvement. You should nudge people toward quality supportive behaviors, screening, training, and team building. You should empower employees. Improving quality should be seen as everyone's job. And then you should use online systems to inform all the latest best practices. And then emphasizing that the performance can and must be improved because competitors don't rest. But now let's take a look at the benefits of information technologies. While they enable better strategy execution through database decisions, they strengthen organizational capabilities, they allow for real-time tracking of implementation initiatives and daily operations, they provide monitoring of empowered employee performance, so electronic scorecards, and they build closer relationships with customers. Then what are the key strategic performance indicators tracked by information systems? Well, first is customer data, operations data, employee data, supplier and or strategic partner data, and financial performance data. But now let's take a look at the techniques for winning sustained energetic commitment of employees to the strategy execution process. So the first thing you could do is providing incentives and engaging in motivational practices that facilitate good strategy execution. And then second is striking the right balance between the rewards and punishment for individual performance. Then third is linking employee rewards to strategically relevant organizational performance outcomes, so you should achieve and not just do. But now let's take a look at the 8 non-monetary approaches to enhancing motivation. So you could provide attractive perks and fringe benefits, you could give awards and other forms of public recognition, you can rely on promotion from within whenever possible, you could invite and act on ideas and suggestions, you could create a work atmosphere of caring and mutual respect, you could state the strategic vision in inspirational terms, you could share the firm's critical information with employees, and provide a comfortable working environment. But now let's take a look at the 6 guidelines for designing effective incentive compensation systems. So first, you could make financial incentives a major, not minor piece of the total compensation package. And then you could have incentives that extend to all managers and workers and not just top management. You could administer the reward system with scrupulous objectivity and fairness. You could ensure that performance targets set for each individual or team involve outcomes that the individual or team can personally affect. You could keep the time between achieving performance targets and receiving rewards as short as possible, and you should avoid rewarding effort rather than results. So what is corporate culture? Well, this is the embedding of shared values, beliefs, business principles, and traditions that instill the firm's operating style, employee behavioral norms, and ingrained in attitudes and work atmosphere. And it influences the firm's actions and approaches to conducting business. But now let's take a look at the 8 key features of a company's corporate culture. Well, it's the values, principles, and ethical standards. It's the management practices and organizational policies. It's the atmosphere and spirit in the firm's work climate. It's how managers and employees interact and relate to each other. It's the peer pressure to conform and observe norms. It's the actions and behaviors encouraged and rewarded. It's the traditions and stories about how we do things around here, and it's how the firm treats stakeholders. But now let's talk about the 2 culture building rules of a company's core values and ethical standards. While they foster a work climate where company personnel share common convictions about how business should be conducted, and they provide company personnel with guidance about how to do their jobs. But now let's take a look at the 8 ways to embed cultural norms in the organization. Well, first is screening applicants and hiring those who'll mesh well with the culture. Second is incorporating discussions of the firm's culture and its behavioral norms into orientation programs for new employees and training courses for managers and employees. Third is having senior executives frequently reiterate the importance and the role of the firm's values and ethical principles at the firm's events and in internal communications to employees. Fourth is expecting managers at all levels to be cultural role models and exhibit cultural norms in their own behavior. Fifth is making the display of cultural norms a factor in evaluating each person's job performance, granting compensation increases, and offering promotions. Sixth is stressing that line managers all the way down to the first level supervisors give ongoing attention to explaining the desired cultural traits and behaviors in their areas and clarifying why they're important. Then seventh is encouraging company personnel to exert strong pressure on co-workers to conform to the expected cultural norms. And then lastly, eighth is holding periodic ceremonies to honor people who excel in displaying the company values and ethical principles. So a strong culture firm has deep deeply rooted, widely shared values, behavioral norms, and operating approaches. And it insists that its values and principles be reflected in the decisions and actions taken by all company personnel. And a weak culture firm lacks values and principles that are constantly preached or widely shared. It has few or no traditions, beliefs, values, common bonds, or behavioral norms. But now let's take a look at why corporate culture matters to the strategy execution process. While a culture that's well matched to the strategy focuses the attention of employees on what's most important to the effort, and then culture-induced peer pressure further induces personnel to do things in a manner that aids the cause of good strategy execution. And then corporate culture can energize employees, deepen their commitment to execute the strategy flawlessly, and enhance worker productivity. But now let's take a look at the healthy cultures that aid in good strategy execution. Well, first we have high performance cultures, so they have a commitment to achieving stretch objectives and accountability. And then we have adaptive cultures. They have a willingness to accept change and take on challenges. This all leads to good strategy execution and thus performance. But now let's take a look at the 5 unhealthy cultures that impede good strategy execution. Well, first we have change-resistant cultures, politicized cultures, insular, inwardly focused cultures, unethical and greed-driven cultures, and incompatible subcultures. This all leads to poor strategy execution and thus poor performance. But now let's talk about changing a problem culture. And this is because a strong, out-of-sync, or unhealthy culture must be changed in order to execute the strategy successfully. And competent leadership at the top is necessary for culture change efforts to succeed. So let's take a look at the 4 steps to changing a problem culture. Well, step 1 is identifying dysfunctional facets of the present culture. Step 2 is specifying what actions characterize the new actions. Step 3 is talking openly about problems with the current culture and making a case for reform. And step 4 is ingraining a new culture with intentional actions for change. But then how do we go about making a compelling case for culture change? Well, you could explain why and how certain behavioral norms and work practices are obstacles to good execution of strategic initiatives. And then you could explain how new behaviors and work practices will produce better results. And then if the need for cultural change is due to a change in strategy, cite reasons why the current strategy has to be modified. But now let's take a look at the 7 substantive culture-changing actions. Well, first is replacing key executives who are resisting or obstructing the needed organizational and cultural changes. Second is promoting individuals who support cultural shifts and can serve as role models for the cultural behavior. Third is appointing outsiders with the desired cultural attributes to high-profile positions. Fourth is screening all candidates for positions carefully, hiring only those who appear to fit with the new culture. Fifth is mandating that all personnel attend culture training. Sixth is designing compensation incentives that boost the pay of teams and individuals who support culture change. And then seventh is revising policies and procedures to drive cultural change. But what are some symbolic culture-changing actions? Well, this could be top executive and upper management behaviors, because they set and communicate the vision and they set an example. And then there could also be ceremonial events to honor exemplary employees, for example, Employee of the Month. And then we could have physical symbols that represent the new culture, so door titles, parking spaces, etc. But then how long does it take to change a problem culture? Well, changing a problem culture is never a short-term exercise. A sustained and persistent effort to reinforce the culture at every opportunity through words and actions is required. It takes time for a new culture to emerge, and it can take 2 to 5 years. And then leading strategy execution requires the following: staying on top of what's happening and closely monitoring progress, putting constructive pressure on the organization to execute the strategy well and achieve operating excellence, initiating corrective actions to improve strategy execution, and achieving the targeted performance results. But how does one stay on top of how things are going? Well, you could do this through management by walking around, MBWA. So this is used by leaders to stay informed about how well the strategy execution process is progressing. It involves spending time with people at company facilities, asking questions, listening to their opinions and concerns, and gathering first-hand information about how well aspects of the strategy execution process are going. But now let's take a look at the 7 mobilizing efforts for excellence in strategy execution. Well, first is treating employees like valued partners. And then you could foster a feeling of loyalty and pride that energizes members. You could also use empowerment to create a fully engaged workforce. You could set stretch objectives that require personnel to give their best in achieving performance targets. You could use benchmarking, re-engineering, TQM, and Six Sigma tools to focus attention on continuous improvement. You could use motivational techniques and compensation incentives to inspire, nurture a results-oriented work climate, and enforce high standards. And lastly, you could celebrate individual, group, and company successes. And then making corrective action successfully requires a thorough analysis of the situation, good business judgment in deciding what actions to take, and good implementation of the corrective actions. And then you should know that if these three conditions exist, then the firm has good strategic leadership and is a well-managed enterprise. Well, the first condition is that it should be difficult to separate leading the process of executing the strategy from leading the strategy process. The second condition is that crafting, implementing, and executing the strategy is a continuous process that requires adjustment to changing circumstances. And then the third condition is whether the firm has a good strategy and business model, whether the strategy is executed well, and if the firm is achieving its performance targets. So now we move on to block 11 with risk management. Now let's take a look at the business decision categories. So first we have big bet decisions, so infrequent but high risk, for example acquisitions. And then we have cross-cutting decisions. These are frequent and high risk, for example pricing. These are made by business unit heads in cross-functional forums as part of a collaborative process. And then we have delegated decisions. So these are frequent but low risk and are handled by an individual or working team with some input from others. But then what is decision making? Well, it's a complex process that entails choosing to act or not to act in a deliberate manner, and it lends itself to the pursuit of organizational goals. But now let's take a look at the conditions of decision making. So first we have decisions under certainty. This exists when information is sufficient to predict the results of each alternative in advance of its implementation. Certainty is the ideal problem-solving and decision-making environment. And then we have decisions under risk. This exists when decision makers lack complete certainty regarding the results of various courses of action, but they can assign probabilities of occurrence. Probabilities can be assigned through objective statistical procedures or personal intuition. Now we move on to decisions under uncertainty. This exists when managers have little information that they can't even assign probabilities to various alternatives and possible results. So but then what is risk? Well, this is the possibility that events will occur and affect the achievement of strategy and business objectives. So that's the COSO definition. Or it's the effect of uncertainty on objectives, and that's the ISO 3100 definition. But now let's take a look at the traditional versus the contemporary risk perspective. So traditional definitions of risk deal with loss, injury, or other undesirable impacts. Risks have therefore been generally viewed as being negative. But then in terms of the contemporary risk perspective, when an enterprise engages in its activities, it accepts some level of risk. The notion or understanding of risk should therefore explicitly consider possible outcomes, positive or negative. But now what is risk management? Well, this is a continuous process of identifying and determining the extent of risks and putting in place strategies to eliminate or reduce risks that may influence the business strategy, objectives, and implementation of strategies. But now what are the major risk categories? Well, first we have business risks. This relates to the possibility that an organization will or won't compete successfully in its operations. And then we move on to financial risks. This relates to the possibility that an entity will or won't have adequate funds for its operations. And then we have hazard risks. This is concerned with exposures that can cause loss without the possibility of gain. And so successful strategic management is dependent on how well an organization can determine and manage risk. Robust risk management is necessary to ensure operations are effective and efficient. Risk management is essential for business continuity and protection of value. But now, what is enterprise risk management? Well, this is a process affected by an entity's board of directors, management, and other personnel for strategy setting across the enterprise. It's designed to identify potential events that affect the entity and manage risks to be within its risk appetite. And this is to provide reasonable assurance regarding the achievement of the entity's objectives. So actions and conditions, so uncertainty, could lead to consequences, and these could be gains or losses. And these are the elements of risk. But now let's take a look at the COSO ERM cube or framework. Well, this is a framework for designing, implementing, and evaluating internal control for organizations providing enterprise resource management. So it deals with the internal environment, influences the organization's governance process, and the risk and control consciousness of its people. So when taking a look at the COSO ERM cube, we have the components, and this consists of the internal environment, objective setting, event identification, risk assessment, risk response, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring. And all these components contain strategic, operations, reporting, and compliance aspects. And they all operate on the entity level, divisional level, business unit level, and subsidiary level. And the COSO framework's focus is on corporate governance, internal control, risk, and business ethics. But now let's take a deeper look at the COSO framework's components. So first is objective setting. Objectives should be in line with the entity's strategy and risk philosophy. This then drives event identification, risk assessment, and risk response. And then we move on to event identification. So here, potential negative or positive events represent risks that provide a context for assessing risk and alternative responses and or upside to strategy. And then we move on to risk assessment. Here, management considers qualitative and quantitative methods to evaluate the likelihood and impact of potential events individually or by category within a time horizon. And then we move on to risk response. This deals with alternative risk response options and their effect on risk likelihood and impact, as well as the resulting cost versus benefits. And then we move on to control activities. Here we implement policies and procedures throughout the organization at all levels and in all functions to help ensure risk responses. And then we move on to information communication. Here we capture and communicate pertinent information from internal and external sources in a form and time frame that enables personnel to carry out their responsibilities. And then we move on to monitoring. Here we ensure that the ERM activities are functioning as intended and to identify any necessary modifications or improvements. And so the basis of the 2017 COSO guidance is that the ERM should be embedded into the activities of an organization, including the mission, vision, and core values. In developing the strategy, business, and performance objectives, an organization should consider the implications of the selected strategy, the risks to the strategy and performance, and the possibility of the strategy not aligning with core values. So with enterprise risk management, we have the vision, mission, and core values, and this leads to strategy development, which leads to business objective formulation, and this leads to implementation and performance, and this leads to enhanced value. And this is all done through the ERM components. But now, what are the ERM components? Well, first we have governance and culture. So the board exercises risk oversight, establishes structures, and demonstrates commitment to values. And then we have strategy and objective setting. So here you analyze the context and define the risk appetite. And then we move on to performance. So here you identify the risk, you assess the severity of the risk, and then you prioritize the risks. And then we have review and revision. So here you assess the substantial change, and then you review the risk and performance. And then the last ERM component is information communication and reporting. And here you leverage IT and you communicate risk information. And now we take a look at the ISO 31100 made in 2018. So this provides detailed guidelines on the planning, implementing, measuring, and learning features of a risk management system. But it's less explicit on the context, leadership, and support features required for a management system standard. And this is the most popular risk management standard used by organizations. It caters to any organization regardless of size, activity, or sector. So ISO allows organizations adopting it to compare their risk management strategies with an internationally recognized benchmark so as to provide sound principles for risk management and governance. So in terms of the ISO risk management framework, we have integration, design, implementation, evaluation, and improvement. And this all revolves around leadership and commitment. But now let's take a look at the ISO risk management principles. So first we have continual improvement, integrated, structured and comprehensive, customized, inclusive, dynamic, best available information, and lastly, human and cultural factors. And this all revolves around value creation and protection. Then we take a look at the ISO risk management process. So we have the scope, context, and criteria, and then we have risk assessment. And within risk assessment, we have risk identification, risk analysis, and risk evaluation. Then we have the risk treatment. Throughout these processes, we have communication and consultation, monitoring and review, and recording and reporting. But now let's take a closer look at the risk management framework. So in terms of leadership and commitment, it means aligning risk management with the strategy, objectives, and culture of the organization and establishing a risk appetite. And then integration is ensuring risk management is part of all aspects of the organization, so determining management accountability, oversight roles and responsibilities, etc. And then design is understanding the organization and its internal and external context, so allocating resources, establishing communication and consultation arrangements. In terms of implementation, it means developing an appropriate implementation plan, including deadlines, so identifying where, when, and how different types of decisions are made. And then evaluation is measuring framework performance against its purpose and implementation. so whether it remains suitable to support achievement of objectives. And then we have improvement, continually monitoring and adapting the framework to address external and internal changes. And now we take a closer look at the risk management process. So communication and consultation involves bringing different areas of expertise together for each step of the risk management process. And then monitoring and review involves improving the quality and effectiveness of process design, implementation, and outcomes. And then recording and reporting involves communicating risk management activities and outcomes across the organization, so providing information for decision making. In terms of the scope, context, and criteria, it means defining the purpose and scope of risk management activities. And then risk treatment involves selecting the most appropriate risk treatment option. Now let's take a look at risk assessment. So this is made up of risk identification, risk analysis, and risk evaluation. Risk identification is to find, recognize, and define risks that might help or prevent achievement of objectives and consequences. Then we move on to risk analysis of the nature and characteristics of risk. And then risk evaluation is supporting decisions by comparing the results of the risk analysis with the risk criteria to determine significance of the risk. Now we move on to block 12 with results-based management and monitoring and evaluation. So what are results? Well, these are observable, describable, or measurable changes in a state, which are typically derived from a cause and effect relationship. But now let's take a look at the types of results. So results may be apparent within a short time or take years to be fully realized. It could be planned or unforeseen. They could either be positive or negative, and they can be reflected at the level of individuals, groups, or society. Now we move on to results-based management, or RBM. Well, this is a broad management strategy that's used to improve management effectiveness and accountability by using a transparent and participatory approach in the following: defining realistic expected results related to a strategic intent, monitoring progress towards the achievement of expected results and evaluating performance, and reporting and integrating lessons into management decisions. But now let's take a look at the principles of RBM. The first principle is that it's outcome and impact oriented. It leads to a clear understanding of the results to be achieved. And then it's interdisciplinary towards collective results. It ensures more integrated, comprehensive responses. There is also an inclusive and participatory approach. It ensures stakeholders' empowerment. There is also transparency. It ensures everyone has access to information throughout the development. And finally, there is adaptive management. It ensures adaptation to changing circumstances. But now let's take a look at the steps to the RBM approach. Well, in the programming phase, the RBM approach ensures that the delivery of outputs contributing to the achievement of an outcome will be supported by a necessary and sufficient sum of activities. And then during the implementation phase, the RBM approach helps to ensure and monitor that these intended results continue to be supported by all necessary and sufficient resources, financial, human, or institutional. So in terms of the results, we deal with how, so the input and activities. Inputs being the resources required for activities, so funds, personnel, time, etc. And then activities being the actions undertaken to produce results. And then we move on to results, and here we look at what we want to deliver. So this is the output and outcomes. Outputs being the immediate results of activities, so deliverables, and then outcomes being short to medium-term effects of outputs. And then in terms of why, we look at the impact, so the long-term lasting changes resulting from the outcomes. Now let's talk about monitoring and evaluation. So monitoring is the ongoing process by which regular information on the progress being made towards the achievement of goals and objectives are generated. And then evaluation is a time-bounded assessment of either ongoing or completed endeavors, so strategic initiatives, programs, or projects, etc., to determine the extent to which they're achieving stated results and contributing to decision-making. So for monitoring, it's continuous, day-to-day. It documents progress and data is collected regularly and reported frequently. And then for evaluation, it's periodic, so important milestones. It's in-depth analysis of achievements, and data is usually collected periodically, for example at baseline, midterm, or final phases, etc. But we should know monitoring data doesn't do the following. It doesn't provide the basis for attribution and causality for change. It doesn't provide evidence of how changes are coming about or that they are or aren't occurring. And it doesn't address the strengths and weaknesses in the design of the project, program, or policy. But now let's take a look at the types of evaluation. So first we have performance logic evaluation. So this is focused on determining the strength and logic of the causal model behind a policy, program, or project. And then we have implementation logic. This assesses the extent of congruence or compatibility between whatever was intended to be implemented and what happened. And then we have outcomes evaluation. This seeks to establish the effectiveness of interventions. The aim is to determine if targeted groups have benefited as anticipated from the strategic intervention and if desired changes are being realized. And then lastly, we have impact evaluation. This is classic evaluation that attempts to establish if there are any changes in the broader population and the extent to which they can be attributed to the strategic intervention executed. But then what are outcomes? Well, these constitute the core benefits or strategic objectives that the initiative or strategy aims to realize. So the ways of describing outcomes could be the changes in attitude or belief, knowledge or skills, behavior or conditions. But then what are indicators? Well, these are quantitative or qualitative variables used to objectively determine the changes that are being realized by an initiative. And indicators must satisfy the CREAM criteria. So first, they should be clear, so precise and unambiguous. And they should be relevant, so appropriate to the subject at hand. And then they should be economic, so available at a reasonable cost. And they should be adequate, so provide a sufficient basis to assess performance. And they should be monitorable, so responsive to independent validation. So now, what is a log frame or logic framework? Well, this is a systematic, visual approach to designing, executing, and assessing projects, which encourages users to consider the relationships between available resources, planned activities, and desired changes or results. A logic framework provides the skeleton or structure of an initiative. It usually gives a clear picture of an initiative and how its elements, from beginning to end, are systematically linked. It provides a common approach for integrating, planning, implementation, and evaluation. So the logic framework is useful for the following: mapping out program elements, creating a fuller picture of what results and approaches the program team plans to be accountable for, and helping the program team keep their eyes on the ball by focusing on planning, selection, and implementation of activities that lend themselves to the achievement of program objectives. But now we move on to the balanced scorecard. This looks beyond financial measures of performance and recognizes the importance of matters related to internal business processes, customers, as well as learning and growth within the overall scheme of organizational performance. And the balanced scorecard looks at 4 perspectives. First is financial. How do we look to shareholders? And then customers. How do customers view us? And then internal business processes. What must we excel at internally? And then we have learning and growth. How can we continue to improve and create value? So as a tool, the balanced scorecard enables organizations to do the following. First, translating the vision through clarifying and gaining consensus. It also communicates and links. It improves communications with stakeholders, external and internal. It also helps for business planning, aligning business activities and budgets with vision and strategy. And it also helps with feedback and learning. It effectively monitors its performance against preset strategic goals and plans. And we should know that the 4 perspectives in the balanced scorecard, financial, customer, internal business processes, learning, and growth, all have the following elements. First is goals, what the strategy is to achieve in that perspective, and then measures, how progress for that particular goal will be measured, and then targets, referring to the desired value that the company seeks to obtain for each measure. And then we have initiatives, what will be done to facilitate the reaching of the targets,